The next thing we talk about is whether something is overbroad or too vague. It's important to understand that overbreadth means that the law is constructed not narrowly. So when we talk about narrowly tailored, and it's not, when it's overbroad, it takes on too much, it regulates too much speech, that becomes overbroad and it gets struck down until the law gets fixed by the legislature to bring it into kind of narrower confines. Vagueness means you can't understand it. You don't understand what's going on. There's not enough public notice, or too much authority or discretion is involved. And we're going to really just kind of focus on the first one more than the second one. And that being that if you don't understand what the law is, then how are you going to know that you've broken it? Now, I am not saying by any means ignorance of the law is a great excuse. Any judge will tell you just because you're ignorant of the law doesn't get you get out of jail free card. This isn't ignorance. This means if you literally can't tell what a stop is, right? For example, where that line is drawn, then it's hard to enforce. So just imagine the Georgia law says that a stop is a complete stop, right? That does not mean a California roll or a rolling stop. It means a stop, right? Complete halt of movement. Because of that, that is the law. If it was vague and just sort of said, you kind of yielded at a stop sign, then of course all the rolls would be fine. These are things that you have to look at. If you don't understand what the law is, and someone, an irrational person could not understand it, then the law is going to be considered vague, right? And we've talked about kind of that when we talked about like food, right? When we talked about what is healthy food, if healthy food is not defined, then therefore anything could be healthy, right? It depends on the person's perspective. So it becomes important that a law is not vague so that you know that you're not going to break it. Prior restraint is any prohibition on speech prior to publication. That's the definition. Now this is not absolute. It is, the government can stop you from talking about national secrets, troop locations or troop movements. Obscenity is one of those things that we can have. And anything that's going to incite violence can also be stopped. And it's also not freedom from subsequent punishment. Just because the government can't stop you from saying it doesn't mean that you can't be punished for it later, right? So whether it be incitement to violence, maybe it is defamation, those things still apply even if it's not prior restraint. The biggest case that we have in prior restraint is the New York Times versus the United States. This was a case about the Pentagon Papers. If you briefly don't know what the Pentagon Papers were, essentially it was a leak of classified material that essentially said, going back for multiple presidential people, that they had information that we were losing the war in Vietnam, and essentially it was a quagmire, and that we were just losing American men, servicemen, over there, and we were never going to win. And it was known from administration to administration to administration to administration, and we were still there. We were still trying to fight these sorts of battles. And this person thought it was important to leak this information to the American public so that they understood that their government knew that they were sending people to die knowing they would never win. The New York Times and the Washington Post published pieces of this, and the government tried to stop them. And of course, if you've seen the film The Post with Meryl Streep or Tom Hanks, that is kind of what it is looking at. It's a great movie. If you haven't watched it, kind of gives you some of the background and some of the decisions that they had to make going into to kind of do this as the government pressures them to stop censoring. Of course, we've seen this again over and over. We had things like WikiLeaks. There have been numerous people that have leaked data and classified materials to the United States media and to world media. Those things exist today. This is not an issue from the 1970s. These things exist, and the government will try to censor them, and it becomes a question of what is the government interest here. Other prior restraints come in the form of gag orders. So a judge can issue a gag order to keep people from talking about things. They can keep the press out of the courtroom. or keep them from transmitting messages, really for the safety of either the witnesses or to ensure a fair trial, to make sure that the jury's not biased or other things happen when they get sequestered and all sorts of things. But essentially, the judge is responsible to ensure a fair trial, and because of that, sometimes gag orders are issued. Those are under strict scrutiny. The government has to have a compelling state interest, right? In this case, the judge has to have a compelling interest of why they can't allow people to talk about the case. We also have licensing systems. In licensing systems, again, when we talk about renting a park or doing those sorts of things, it has to be an important reason. So the things that have existed in the past are space, preventing crime, preventing fraud, protecting the privacy of both park users and of the neighbors that are surrounding the park. There has to be clear criteria, which means the discretion of the official has to be almost none. It can't be a gray question. It has to be a yes or a no. That is it, one or the other. And then finally, there has to be procedural protections. There has to be some sort of way to appeal it within 7 days. Why is that important? Well, because if it's not within 7 days, you could essentially pocket somebody from doing something, right? If you can say, well, let's just take them to court, and it takes them 6 months to get to court, well, all of a sudden, that 6 months might go over when you were planning on holding a rally, or when you were planning on doing a speech, or would just censor you altogether because your whole idea, your whole movement would get pushed back by months. And so when it comes to these issues, it has to be heard in a speedy way.